Okay, so I've got 145. So welcome everybody. My name is Alex Tarantino. I'm the chair of the Education Committee for Preservation Delaware. So really excited to have you all here today and to have Jean Castellano, our speaker, up next. So before I introduce Jean, just to go over a couple of logistical items. So in Zoom, so we're going to take questions at the end of Jean's presentation. So if you do have a question for Jean, we just ask that you use the Q&A function. It's the button that is at the bottom of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties or need to get in touch with me, you can use the chat function. This presentation will be recorded along with all of the other conference presentations, so you can look for that in a couple of weeks on Preservation Delaware's website and YouTube channel. And then lastly, I just want to give a big thank you to all of our sponsors. We are so grateful for their support and could not have done this without them. So big thanks from us at PDI. And then without further ado, we'll introduce Jean. So Jean is actually one of our board members, so we're really grateful for him being here today, but for his help all of the rest of the year. So Jean is an avid researcher of Delaware history and a former trustee of the Delaware Historical Society, where he chaired the Buildings and Grounds Committee. He's authored several papers and given lectures on many local topics, including the Bancroft textile mills and Woodlawn trustees. He is also the author of Wilmington, Preservation in Progress. So Jean holds a Bachelor of Chemical Engineering degree from Villanova and a Master's in Liberal Studies from the University of Delaware. He also holds professional certifications in museum studies and historic preservation from UD. During his business career, he held positions in product development, finance, and leadership with the DuPont Company and W.L. Gore and Associates. While at Gore, he led the creation of the company's history archive. In 2016, he joined the staff of Hagley Museum and Library to start up Hagley Heritage Curators, a program to help companies and trade associations preserve and research their history. He's presently a contract archivist and historian for the Woodlawn trustees. So welcome, Jean. Thanks so much again for being here.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Okay, moving on. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this. This is really a wonderful story that many people in Wilmington are not aware of. It covers about 120 years of history in a neighborhood called the Flats, created as affordable living. It started as a project for me in historic preservation program as a final project for Kate Morrissey's class on vernacular architecture. And I thought it was just that. And then the semester project, and as it turns out, took on new life and now have the opportunity to share the story with you. Today's lecture, first I want to get you oriented on where are the Flats? I get this question all of the time, even from people who live maybe a few blocks from it. We'll talk about the Bancroft family and their legacy in Wilmington, how it led to the Flats. Specifically, we'll look at the Flats from 4 perspectives: working class housing, which it was intended to do, affordability, the landscape around it, which is a very key component of it, specific details on the architecture and the style of the houses, and then overcoming racial bias in tenant selection. This was a neighborhood that started in early 1900s. Times were very different, had to accommodate growing pains in our society. The Flats are in the process of being rebuilt today to remain affordable for another 100 years. And then I'll talk about some preservation efforts on a portion of those neighborhoods. So I'm using a map, it's from 1928. I like it because it's not cluttered by the details of I-95 and other things. And I'll come back to this map in more detail, but I just want to get you oriented and show you where the Flats are. We start at the Delaware River, come in. Of course, there's the Christina, and joining it is the Brandywine River. And this is where this story really begins. As we come through past Josephine Gardens and Brandywine Park, further up to where the Bancroft family had their textile mills. And so there's a large green space is Rockford Park. Just next to it, Elapocus Woods Park. And further down, this is Woodlawn Park down here, and next to it are the flats. And I'll talk more about this. Parkway Drive was it was the first in Wilmington, a radical new idea at the time for scenic byway. So I've chosen some landmarks that not quite cornerstones, more like triangulation points to get you oriented to what the flats look like today. So we're standing on 5th Street, we're standing on Union Street. And you can see there's a relatively new arch over it. If you don't recognize it, then you're going to look over your left shoulder. And this is what you're going to see, Mrs. Rubino's Italian restaurant. Wilmington landmark, been there a long time. Perhaps you have. And so that marks one portion of the flats. Another cornerstone of sorts is on 4th Street with Bancroft Parkway there in the foreground. And that's the St. Thomas of Apostle Church. Churches play a role in the layout of the flats. And just up from it is the Laurelton Assisted Living Senior Center, which some of you may have once known as the Lohr School, public school in Delaware. It turns out I had a father-in-law who spent many years at the Laurelton. We would frequently visit, have family parties there. There's a Woodlawn Park is across the way, and it always impressed me that park was so heavily used. But I must confess, I did not know I was on the edge of the flats the time I was there. Across from the Laurelton St. Thomas is a very ornate stone wall containing very modern townhouses. This was the location at one point of Little Sisters of the Poor. You may remember they were here. I'll talk more about them. They relocated to Newark, Delaware in 1976, but the stone wall remains. Another triangulation point, get you oriented on the flats, is the Woodlawn Library. Built in 2006, new library replaced a very tiny one in a building actually in the center of the flats, where the library had been on, I believe, the 2nd and 3rd floors of the building that also served as a rental office. So this was a major enhancement to local library. And right next to it is an important structure. It's a walking bridge over the B&O Railroad. This was something that once was envisioned could not be done, but felt necessary. This was something Mr. Bancroft really wanted to do in early 20th century. Started it, didn't quite complete it. And so 2005, in preparation for the library, the bridge was built. Woodlawn trustees funded it, designed it, had it built, and have gifted it to the city of Wilmington. So yet again, if you don't know exactly where you are, I'm going to give you one more landmark, the Woodlawn Library we were just looking at. You might remember what was there beforehand. This was the Delaware Division of Motor Vehicles, and many of us went there to get our driver's license renewed or get our motor vehicles inspected and registrations renewed. And I have an aerial view of that. Here's those buildings we were just looking at there. And notice the lines of cars waiting to get into the inspection site. I have sat in those lines of cars myself. Once again, I confess, I did not know I was in the flats, which are here in the upper portion. And this is a great photo because it shows you kind of the impact of the B&O Railroad on the neighborhood. And now it really just cuts it in half, if you will. In fact, if we look over here, there are 2 incomplete bridge abutments, part of a project in the Depression to build a bridge. Did not get completed. World War II started, and people moved on to other higher priorities. So that bridge ultimately became an object realized, and even though it was considered an opportunity that might have been lost. I'd like to talk about William P. Bancroft. He is the inspiration for the flats and many other things that took place in the city of Wilmington. This is an obituary page from him from the company's Bancroft Mills Bulletin. He lived to a good age. Many people tell me they've not really heard of him, or they sort of know his name. And he liked it that way. He was a very devout Quaker, quiet gentleman. He, even though he was very much an industrialist peer to men like Alfred I. DuPont or Coleman DuPont, he shunned publicity. In fact, he sat on no corporate boards. He only sat on the City of Wilmington Park Commission, but is also very active in public education, libraries. And so that was where he spent his time and devoted a great deal of money to. He had two daughters who went to college in the UK. That's where the family was from. And then ultimately married men there and they became very active in the family business in England. You may have heard of it. Clark shoes, still very popular today, sold throughout the United States. So the Clark family has a lot of UK ties to the Bancroft family here in the United States. I think it's appropriate to talk about the source of funds that ultimately led to the creation of a number of things in the city of Wilmington. And Bancroft Mills was formed by Joseph Bancroft. He came over in the 1800s from England. He had worked in the textile mills there, understood the trade, had relationships to suppliers. He, by virtue of being a devout Quaker, was a friend of William Penn. And he had two sons, Samuel and William. Samuel went on to help create the Delaware Art Museum, and he collected a great deal of early English art that has become an important part of the Delaware Art Museum's seed collection. William Bancroft didn't collect things as much as he acquired land for preservation. But if we look at this page, it's from the Bancroft and Sons corporate brochure, 1927, very much a family business. See many Bancroft family members actively engaged. And that's the way it was. But the two principals were William and Samuel. Thought it'd be fun to go back and look at the mills for just a moment. They're along the Brandywine down in the area that runs from what would be known as Kentmere up to Rockford. In fact, no coincidence, behind it is the beginnings of Rockford Park, and the open space is what leads up to the Bancroft family homes. And further up is the Delaware Art Museum area. Again, no coincidence that it was created on Bancroft family lands. Across the river, you may have crossed this bridge. We have Alapocas Woods State Park. Both of those parks owe their existence largely to William Bancroft. Today, you may know, these are condominiums. It's been quite an effort going on over many, many years. Take down the mill buildings and replace them. So I think it's important to recognize what made Bancroft Mills famous. They were one of the most successful textile companies in the United States in the later half of the 1800s and up to mid 20th century. And they wove their own yarns, and more importantly, created very innovative ways for finishing them to change their characteristics. And then were really significant marketeers in promoting their new products. Bancroft Mills fabrics went into apparel, home draperies, other home furnishings for furniture, wallpaper, even found its way to book covers, a very successful market for them. I was in a Gore-Tex fabrics business for many years, and I like to go back and look at fashions. And I thought you might enjoy this quick look at one of Bancroft Mill's most successful products, Banlon fabric. And this happens to be a workbook from 1965. It was actually the high watermark for the company. And they're promoting their new Banlon fabric, and made in conjunction with a new process then called circular knitting. So it was just a crimping process that would take nylon, but what it did is it made it softer, made it drape better, and it took off that reflective luster that we tend to associate with synthetics. And you get these wonderful looking different fashions here. 60s really come through with some of the print patterns on it. And then the other key part of making Bancroft Mill successful was their marketing efforts. And although we don't think of Miss America's contest as very relevant today, it was a media powerhouse event in 1940s through the 1960s. And Bancroft Mills was a lead sponsor for it. I happen to pick this cover from 1951. It's the year I was born. And it shows some of the fashions and some of the gowns. And again, what's happening here is Bancroft Mill's ability to take inexpensive, simple cottons and chintz and do things to those textiles to give them luster, body, drape in a special way. And so it was a very, very successful marketing and branding event for them. The mills, I'm sorry to say, were sold in the 1960s to a New England textile company who essentially just used the trademarks. And the company no longer operated along the Brandywine. That's a topic for a whole different lecture. So unfortunate, but a great deal of wealth had been accumulated by that point in time. And Mr. William Bancroft channeled his to education, libraries, and land acquisition and smart land use. He was very involved in Wilmington Friends School. It's now located near Alapocus Woods by virtue of his help to have it move out of the crowded city up that way. He was also very active in the Swarthmore College. In fact, all the Bancroft family members had been involved with Swarthmore from its earliest time. In 1901, William Bancroft created something called the Woodlawn Company, later renamed the Woodlawn Trustees, and had some very specific objectives: land preservation, planned housing, controlled development for the citizens of Wilmington. Keeping in mind, the city was as far as one could see, so to speak. You came up to the Brandywine 100, you had relatively few farms spaced quite a ways apart. That didn't stop Mr. Bancroft from acquiring land up there, but the key focus was the city of Wilmington. Newcastle County didn't really have a government at that point in time. And so that's where his efforts were largely directed. And he wrote a note, appears in the director's meeting minutes, to the Woodlawn Board in 1902. I'm going to read it to you. He said, "I believe it would prove pecuniarily profitable and in other ways a useful thing to build up the tract bound by 4th, Union, and 7th Streets and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad with small houses to remain in the ownership of the Woodlawn Company as an investment for charitable and educational institutions." This was really kind of a novel idea. Yes, he wanted to create good, high quality living, but he was doing it as an investment vehicle that he would then gift to charitable and educational institutions so that over time, that neighborhood would actually create profits and increase the value of the stock. So a little bit different approach from what we might think today. So it was 1902 that he announced his vision. I'm going to talk more specifically about the development of the flats, and I'm going to do it through 4 topics: working class housing of the day, the greater landscape of the flats, architectural plan and style, which was very, very unique, and then overcoming racial bias in tenant selection. This is from a class on vernacular architecture I took a year ago, and one of the chapters was worker housing. And these happen to be 4 family rental flats in the city of Chicago, about the same time as what was created in Wilmington. There's a stark difference between them. Worker housing at the time was done in a very cookie cutter means so that they could be built simply, affordably, not necessarily affordable to the tenant, but to the builder, so they could build lots of them, get them into relatively tight spaces. These are not unattractive. I mean, the gables have a nice look to them. Other than some brickwork, there's not a whole lot of detail going on. Clearly a shared entrance to get to the first and second floors. And most importantly, not a lot of green space. This happens to be a corner unit, you see some, but generally speaking for the others, yards were virtually non-existent. Pretty typical for the time. And rental housing was actually somewhat of a novel idea. So early part of the flats was affordability. How do we get at that? How do we measure it and critique it? So one way was to go to the 1930 census. We did a fairly deep dive on home ownership statistics. And so to give you the bigger picture of rental housing in Wilmington, at the time, half the rentals were between $30 and $74 a month. Below that, there was another big increment between $20 and $29 a month. So we can say almost 80% of rental housing in the city of Wilmington was between $20 and $74 a month. Now, how does the flats stack up to it? At this point, it's about 20 years old, and their rents range from 19 to 30. They were very definitely on the lowest tier of rentals in the city of Wilmington, but that was also for 4 to 8 rooms. 8 rooms was a pretty spacious rental property. And as you're going to hear, you got a lot of things for that rent that others did not. Utilities, services, indoor amenities. Come back to that in just a moment. All of the records pertaining to the flats have gone to Hagley Museum and Library. There's been a long relationship between Woodlawn trustees and Hagley. And in fact, 2 years ago, I came on to start working with Woodlawn to plan out yet another large move of archives and records to Hagley, which was completed earlier this year. One of those is just lists of tenants. And I thought it's kind of fun to look at who were these folks, what did they do? Because again, this was worker housing. These are addresses. S means Springer Street. U means Union Street. We saw that. And if we just look at, let's say, some of the 5-room houses, we see individuals who are paper hangers, machinist, typesetter at the Evening News Journal. Continuing down, we have a foreman at a textile company. There was one driver for Clover Dairy. Perhaps some of you remember Clover Dairy in its day. Even a trolley car operator and a train engineer. So a very, very diverse group of individuals. And what you don't necessarily see is diversity in terms of last name. I'll come to that in just a moment. One last thing before we leave here. There are a number of women. Here's Mrs. Lucy Zebley, no employment. We also have Mrs. Rodenheiser, no employment. And then Mrs. Geisen, no employment. In all likelihood, these are widows. They had lived there with family, husbands who had passed on. and they would continue to be able to pay the rent and stay in the flats. People really enjoyed living there, again, because they offered a lot of amenities and a great neighborhood setup. So that was working class housing. Let's talk about the landscape of the flats and what influenced it. The bigger picture is park system in the city of Wilmington. As I said, the only board that Mr. Bancroft was very active in was the Wilmington Park System when it was created. He's considered the father of that organization. And he was very impressed by what Frederick Law Olmsted was doing in Central Park, New York, Prospect Park, Park in Baltimore, even some influence in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. And Mr. Bancroft wanted to change Wilmington to realize some of the same landscape. And again, he was a young man, age of 30, when the Civil War came. And you may know, industry blossomed along the Christina River. So a lot of shipbuilding. There was a lot of leather making in this part of the city. And then further up on the Brandywine, Wilmington is very known for its flour mills. So industrialization found its way along the rivers. Housing came along with it. Mr. Bancroft was very concerned that the next group of industries would just come further up the Brandywine. Ironically, their family did here with their mills. And so this was the first park. There was a serious effort to preserve the land there. And then again, additionally, Rockford, Ellapocus, I believe that's Matson Run. But another important legacy of William Bancroft was the creation of one of the first parkways, a wider thoroughfare, largely green with trees. And after he passed away, they did name it Bancroft Parkway. So that theme carries over into the layout and design of the flats. This is an early map that shows a number of things. We saw that aerial of the inspection station. So here's the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, again, a key end marker, if you will. We have 4th Street, St. Thomas Church, we saw that earlier, and Little Sisters of the Poor, then Bancroft Parkway, newly created, along Union Street. We were there earlier. So you can see the layouts of the homes that were created altogether, about 450 units. And one other thing I'm going to point out, we have a little building here and you can't probably make it out, but it says sold. And it was sold to Wesleyan Baptist Church. So part of the vision of the flats, to have community and faith centers, as well as the law school, which eventually came in here, with parks and playgrounds being an active part of it. This was a very novel idea for the time. One last point, I should come back. There was a company town or village in the UK that had very much to do with inspiring William Bancroft to lay out the flats in this way. It was known as Bourneville, and it was created by the Cadbury chocolate family in the UK. A radical new concept there of having lakes, parks, outdoor recreation as part of worker villages, but also utilizing houses that are relatively unique architecture and very attractive. Today, Bourneville is considered one of the most attractive places to live in England. So how did they come to be? What do the designs actually look like? We have a handwritten passage. It's actually Lucy Bancroft, William Bancroft's wife, writing notes from a board meeting, and she's informing the board. We have been working with William Brinkley as to plans for row houses to extend from 6th Street to 7th Street on the westerly side of Springer. Plans are not yet completed. Hope to feel ready to go with building in the spring. This was January 1903. In fact, they did start in the spring. And Mr. Brinkle whose family lived not far from Kitmere area. Relatively young architect at the time. Started working closely with Mr. Bancroft. And we'll see here how some of those houses actually turned out. These drawings, many of them for all of the blocks of the flats, are in Hagley Library. Here's one section. It's from Springer Street near 6th. We'll be able to actually look at photographs of what was created. And the point is, it's not very cookie cutter. There's a lot of unique features in these. You have individual entrances. In some cases, in the larger units, there are front porches. Architectural details like arched headers over the windows. In some cases, 4 separate entrances where you have a renter living over a renter. Sounds very normal today, but it was a very new concept at the time. And so here's a view of that block. Now, this was taken from the Little Sisters of the Poor building. And it's interesting, we're looking out towards Rockford Tower. It's kind of an appropriate view because we're looking, sort of paying homage to the Bancroft family whose homes were all here. And there's much going on. Again, this diversity of architectural style. The end units had bays. Again, you could see arched dormers over the windows, in many cases porches. And it's kind of a fun drawing because there's some things going on. Here's a milk delivery taking place. And you'll have to trust me on this one. This is a coal delivery. What would happen is the coal would be brought in and then shoveled into the basement in small windows underneath the porches. An innovation of the flats was that there was coal-fired stoves and coal-fired furnaces that heated all of the buildings. Another view of the flats. Again, now we're looking at Little Sisters of the Poor building. So you can see that elevated vantage point that last photo was taken from. This building expanded pretty significantly. They did a wing on both sides of it, again, before moving down to Newark. And this was a house that gave way to St. Thomas Apostle Church. So it's fun to see the beginnings of Bancroft Parkway, trees, as well as greenscape. Another view that starts to give a sense for other utilities that were built into the flats. Gas lighting was part of the plan, although you don't see it. Electrification started in a number of the buildings in the early 1900s, and by 1930, all of the flats buildings had been electrified. You see there's sidewalks, there are a view of the porches, there is city water and city sewers. So again, all provided as utilities to the tenant, as well as the maintenance and upkeep. Another big innovation was the backyard spaces at the flats. And again, there's architectural drawings of what these looked like. And let me explain what's going on here. It's a way to provide a service alley for trash pickup, coal delivery, and then individual pathways into each unit so that each unit had its own outside entrance. On the second floor, you had stairways accommodated separate rather than a common hallway. Cast iron fences, some of them are still in place. Reminded of Robert Frost's comment, good fences make good neighbors. And this helped sort of segregate individual spaces that could be used for ornamental plantings or for food, and also gave areas for laundry. Some of these laundry clothesline poles are still there, have very, very decorative ironwork on it. And actually some of them be in the process of being saved as renovations take place. So even the backside was fairly unique for rental housing at the time. When we move from architecture to tenant selection, this is a challenging period, difficult topic to address. As a devout Quaker, William Bancroft never intentionally excluded people of color from living in the flats. It was simply the normal rental practice of the early 20th century. There's good and bad in that, but that's the practice at the time. And in fact, this bothered him a great deal. He and another number of wealthy Wilmington citizens gathered together in 1925 to create something called the Citizens Housing Corporation to acquire housing on the East Side for Blacks. The initial experiment was not run very well. Mr. Bancroft just became impatient with it. In 1927, he just bought the whole thing and eventually brought it into and under Woodlawn trustees to be operated by Woodlawn. As it turns out, through 20th century into 1960s, the rental operations for the flats in the East Side were contracted to a separate real estate company. They were not operated by the trustees. And unfortunately, the real estate company opted for what you would call neighborhood harmony in the flats at the expense of integration. And you can imagine the challenges that arose from that. Also going on at the same time was this was post-World War II. Mr. Bancroft acquired thousands of acres of farmland in north of Wilmington between Concord Pike and the Brandywine. And Woodlawn was now focused on creating neighborhoods, as well as retail, business, rentals, and that's where their focus was, not necessarily on the city properties. Well, this look the other way approach boiled over in 1968. You will remember this. This happens to be an Evening Journal headline, City of Wilmington, April 9th, 4 days after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And as we all know, there was a significant amount of rioting, looting, demonstrations that took place across the United States. 100 cities had different kinds of problems. Wilmington's, in some respects, was the worst in that it brought National Guard occupation into the city that lasted longer than any other one. They had, I believe, 2,500 National Guard who occupied the city of Wilmington through 9 months. Clearly, change had to take place. And so from that, it's interesting, the first call out to the Woodlawn trustees on its rental practices, not just for Blacks, but for people of Jewish faith, even some discrimination against Italians nearby Little Italy, was called out by the Society of Friends, Bancroft family's fellow Quakers, who demonstrated. And frankly, this became quite an issue even in the Philadelphia Regional Society of Friends discussing Woodlawn's rental practices. At the same time, the state of Delaware did an in-depth investigation, voiced a formal complaint in 1972 about discrimination at tenants, and made strong recommendations to change the policies. Bancroft family reacted to that, took it very seriously. And as it turns out, Mr. William Bancroft's grandson, Stephen Clark, from the Clark family, came over to become the new board chair for the Woodlawn trustees. And he effected many, many changes for the positive. One of those was they immediately went back and looked at 2 years of flats rental applications, identified 2 Black women who clearly would have met all other requirements to be a tenant. And they were allowed to move in. And shortly thereafter, with another 7 families, Black families who also moved into the flats. And ever since, it has been a very integrated neighborhood. This also was a wake-up call for Woodlawn's East Side properties. and put into focus improvements that needed to be done there. So fast forwarding today, after 100 years of the flats, they are in the process of a rebuild. These are the photos I took in 2017. I believe this was phase 2. And what you're seeing is buildings that will in fact come down. And that in itself is a bit controversial. In fact, when we go back here just a moment, as we often talk about in preservation in Delaware, even came up this morning in Barksdale Maynard's presentation. Many buildings in Delaware, old significant status, just get torn down either because of neglect or bigger plans by developers to do something else with farmland. In this particular case, even though the original buildings are not being kept preserved, the original concept and intent is still going to be preserved. That is affordable housing with many amenities as being preserved by the same family entity, if you will. So different approach to preservation, very much preserving the concept and building new to afford another 100 years of good living. So this is a very expensive undertaking, obviously, and in fact had to be phased in by the Woodlawn trustees. These first 2 phases, as you see in this map, were funded by Woodlawn. Keep in mind, they don't have the Bancroft Mills cash machine to help fund their operations the way they did 100 years ago. So this had to be done section at a time, section at a time. And then as they got into later phases, here 3 and 4, 5, further back, you'll see in this chart, it mentions number of units to be renovated, to be rebuilt, and then the application of low-income housing tax credits. This was a program in conjunction with the state of Delaware to utilize low-income tax credits to help also redo the flats buildings. Additional phases are on the drawing board. Things have not yet been cast in stone on what will happen with them, but more to come. There is a commitment. This is something that started 2015, will easily take at least 10 years to fully realize. It's a slow process. One has to do good by the tenants, help them find alternate living accommodations, and then they have first dibs on coming back. And so, as I said, these are all rebuilds, but there is a block existing to remain, and that's between 7th and 8th Street. And that will be, I'll come back to that in just a moment. So what do the new flats look like? Well, they maintain the architectural character, if you will, very much brick. Some style similarities, arched window headers, front porches. But what they've also been able to do is bring closer off-street parking because more people have cars today. Heating in the flats had become electric. It's very expensive. And so the unit might have had affordable rent, but it really wasn't affordable living by virtue of that kind of utility. So heat pumps are very much part of the plan, as is in some cases solar assist for these buildings. They'll have multiple bathrooms, Wi-Fi, and kitchen conveniences. This one block will be preserved. Plans for that are in the process of being developed. There's a better view of those. And this is the park across the way. And part of the conversations with the Delaware State Historic Preservation Office is to capture the history of the flats, the buildings that are gone, in a series of historic markers that will be built and installed in the park. I'm currently working with Woodlawn on what those stories are going to be. So this begs the question that Barksdale Maynard asked this morning: do we have truly original Delaware architecture? His argument was generally no. but he and I need to collaborate more because I do believe this is truly original Delaware architecture created by a Delaware architect, landscape inspired out of England, but not the exact housing styles and designs. So more to come on that conversation. The Flats is part of Woodlawn's greater focus on city housing. And so they are also doing a great deal in the east side area to upgrade and improve the quality of the houses that they own over in those areas as well. So concluding today, Woodlawn is a leader in affordable housing, done so with thoughtful development and continue to try and preserve land, use it in the smartest, best way for residents. They operate as three entities. Woodlawn Trustees is a very much for-profit that operates everything from shopping centers and office buildings to rental homes. But it also has a specific foundation, the Todd Morton Foundation, focused on affordable living and improvements for that, such as the Flats renovations. And then the Rockford Woodlawn Fund, which is focused on helping to fund improved access and better projects for parks and green space. So these organizations can look for separate funding mechanisms to do a breadth of different kinds of activities. If you get a chance, check out their website, woodlawntrustees.com. So thank you for coming today. Halloween will be here very soon. This happens to be a house in the Flats, decorated this way, believe it or not, on the first day of school when I was over there and walking around. And it was just fun to see people getting excited even that early. You can tell people just enjoy living in the Flats. So with that, thank you very much. And I guess we'll go to questions, Alex.
Awesome. Thank you, Jean. I love that photo. It's, for me personally, it's never too early to start decorating for home. So
a lot of thought went into this, quite honestly.
That's great. That's great. Well, we do have a couple of questions here coming in. So let's see. So two of these are kind of related. So they, are sort of dealing with the fact that most of the flats will be demolished and rebuilt. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the intersection of affordable housing and historic preservation? And, if you have any thoughts on how to balance these two objectives?
So in the context of the Flats, and let me begin by saying my role with them is archivist and historian. I don't engage in current operations with them, but I certainly have occasional opportunity to converse with them about how some of these projects are going. The world of affordable living is actually very well defined by county and I believe state formulas that would look at the income of a rent, or rather look at the rent to be charged and look at it relative to their total income and make sure that it hits certain criteria that deem it affordable, not affordable by Woodlawn, but by government entities. And then it becomes a matter of creating housing that will meet that financial outcome. So very much part of the modern designs are looking what can be done to make a building that will last 100 years, give it the right kind of modern amenities, quality of life people would expect today, and yet still retain some element of affordability. So in this case, fairly unique in that it's a complete rebuild, but meeting government formulas that did not have to be done so. Further complicated by low-income tax credits, which factor in, which also dictate what can be done and how quickly it can be done.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So let's see. So you mentioned that one block of the flats will be retained. Can you tell us a little bit more about the plans for those? Will they be rehabilitated or will they just sort of be preserved, for folks to kind of observe from the outside?
Um, I will need some help from Wood One trustees, but in our last conversations, we had a meeting with Delaware State Housing Authority and State Historic Preservation Office on that. And Wood One is currently working with a company to establish what the facades, how the facades will be retreated. The intent is to preserve them. Possibly they may need to be rebuilt to look exactly like what was there, but they're trying very hard to maintain the existing shell of the building to as close to what it had been. The interiors will be changed, obviously, to accommodate 21st century living. So it's a work in progress still on this point.
Okay, great. And so it sounds like, I guess, that the Woodlawn trustees have been working with this project.
Yes, they have been. And I'm also part of that effort to define what the historic markers are going to be, what the content will be on that.
Yeah, and well, speaking of that, so it sounded like the historic markers and maybe interpretive panels, will those be, you mentioned they were going to be in sort of a park or open space, will that be located near the block of houses that the intent is to retain them?
Yes, it's going to be right in front of them, quite honestly. So here you go. You have this block immediately across the sidewalk. Actually, these units face that park, just part of Bancroft Parkway. So the markers would go in there, so very close by. But part of our focus is also going to be recall the memory of buildings that are gone. So such as Springer Street, which is going to be rebuilt. But it'd be nice. We have those original architectural plans and we have a handful of photos of Hagley. So I see those becoming part of these markers.
That would be super interesting, yeah, to see that while you're actually sort of on the landscape. Let's see, I'm just looking through our questions here. So I know you mentioned, Jean, you're not super involved with the construction part. That is a lot of the questions coming in are about the new construction, but I guess if you know anything about sort of the decision making with was rehabilitation of the existing structures considered, I guess, at least maybe from the exterior, kind of the facade, and then kind of rehabbing or working on the interiors. If again, I know you mentioned you weren't involved with that, but if you have anything to comment on that part.
I can't really, I don't have the background in that because it's been going on for a number of years. Quite honestly, it's being approached in phases and each one's slightly different depending on the amount of parking they want to build into it. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't give a better answer at this point, but.
No worries, appreciate it. See, so, oh, here's a good one. Do you have any plans to publish your work on the flats, or maybe turn this collection of photos and drawings into an Images of America book, or maybe something similar?
Great question. I've certainly given thought to Images of America, but I also think there's opportunity to do something more. But I feel very strongly whatever I do needs to be in concert with the Wood One trustees. I have written articles, will continue to write articles for Hagley Museum and Libraries monthly newsletter. So there's one there already you can find very quick that will repeat some of the story here on the flats. My personal vision would be to do a documentary. I think it's a wonderful topic. I think for the amount of money, effort one puts into a book, I think a public TV oriented documentary could be very effective, just given the increasing importance of affordable housing in the United States. I mean, we hear the word every day now. And here's a case though, where Somebody figured it out 100 years ago, and now we're figuring out what it looks like for the next 100 years.
Yeah, fantastic. That is an interesting idea. I feel like, yeah, more and more our world, we're so virtual.
Yeah.
I do love the idea of a documentary, though. I think that would be really neat. So let's see. I guess, well, on that topic, as I'm thinking about it, have you considered, or is there sort of an oral history component to this work, with maybe people who or families of folks who may have lived here?
Excellent question. There has been no formal attempt, although there are a number of individuals whose stories come up. And I think it would just simply be a matter of, I think Woodlawn and I could work on this. Actually, this is something Hagley Museum and Library does very, very well. And so I see them as a potential organization for assisting with it. I think there's two aspects of these oral histories. One is the people who lived there and what they went through, to relocate, come back. I do think that would be worthwhile effort. And then there's the people who manage it from the Woodlawn trustee side, right? The trustees, some few folks on the Woodlawn board have been there a very, very long time. And we have talked about capturing their memories because it goes way beyond the flats to our state park or national park as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that would be
Yeah, I'm
really
making note of that one actually. I think that'll be the conversation have with Woodlawn.
awesome. Let's see. So I think we have time for one more question. So this one's sort of zooming out a little bit, but asks if you have any plans to research and present on the post-war Bancroft landscape on Route 202.
I have already actually.
Oh.
I did a presentation in March at Cooksbury Village. And so today is, I believe, my fourth presentation in this general topic. The first two were done at Osher Institute at a program called Hagley Does History. And when I was on staff there, I did a series of presentations. I was more in depth on the Bancroft Mills and then sort of the foundings of Woodlawn trustees. The one for Cokesbury was to take it out of the city and up into Brandywine 100. So I do have something there. I think it's a lot of fun. Dee Durham and I talk about this could be a good one for Brandywine 100 Historical Society. So I think people would be amazed that the shopping centers along 202, Wilmington University, Delaware, business buildings that are there, as well as what took place with all the neighborhoods, Sharpley, where I live, Eden Ridge, Tavistock, Alapocas, Woodbrook. So, yes.
Oh, well, that's great to know. So it sounds like maybe there is a presentation in the works, either through the Brandywine Historical Society, did you say?
Yes, I think, I think it kind of fits in there. That's kind of an easy putt, but more to come, I think, on maybe other venues.
Well, that sounds good. Well, maybe we can have you present at one of our webinars next year if it works out that way. All
Sounds
right.
good.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Jean. We are at time here, but that was fascinating, and you've done a ton of research. So just fantastic job. I loved your presentation and all of the graphics. So we really appreciate your time today.
Okay, great.
And so for our attendees, thank you so much for coming. So we still have a lot more to come. We have a couple more presentations today, and then we've got a full day tomorrow of presentations. And then, of course, if you haven't seen this already, we are having an in-person gathering at the Couch Diet Mills property in Newark. So there is still time to register for that. If you go online to the Eventbrite page where you registered to attend these sessions, to get a ticket for tomorrow, I believe there are still spots left for the tours of the mills. So So I think that'll be a really interesting sort of opportunity to see the site in a way that maybe you wouldn't normally, or you haven't yet. So I hope you can join us for that. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and close the room. We've got about 15 minutes until our next presentation or session starts at 3. So I welcome you to join us again at 3. You can use the same link to log in that you did for this presentation. And again, thanks so much, Jean. Thanks to our sponsors, and then thank you to our attendees. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.